Year is 1517. You are a monk in Germany, and there's this really annoying dude named Tetzel that's running around selling indulgences. What do? Start a reformation. Welcome back to Constructive Interference. I am Joel Kurtnitis. Josh Hugo is my co-host. We're gonna talk about the Protestant Reformation some today. We're also going to talk about the idea of purifying versus separating, and kind of how we can tie that into both the Reformation and, hey, who knows, maybe even American politics. But first, personal interest. It's come to our attention that, hey, we're sort of unintroduced and there's a bunch of stuff that you really might not know about us. So how about, Josh, to start off today, you share something interesting that our audience just might not even know about you?
Well, I'm sure my audience knows very little about me, but I'm not sure it'll be interesting. Uh, well, I was going to say one interesting fact about me that people might not anticipate is I voted for a Democrat once. I voted for Kate Clunan when I lived in Illinois, and by voting for Kate Clunan, the Democrat, I ensured that the Republican would win. Not directly, just that whoever I vote for always loses. So,
wow, you don't. Just like that, the search for a new co-host has begun.
Oh man! Hey, I lasted for 3 episodes. It's a good run. I had a good run.
No. It's good. It's good. Hey, no, that's I have thought about it a couple times. I have thought about it, especially because I live, or well, you know what? Now I'm in sort of the bluest part of Iowa. But up until lately, I'd lived in complete red country, and I thought, how funny would it be just to vote for a Democrat, just a sympathy vote, you know? And you know, frankly, there are some people that are in there are some people on the right that potentially scare me more than your mainline Democrats. I will admit to that. So interesting fact about me. Or fact about me. I don't know about interesting. Again, I used to be, and sometimes am still when there's not a lot going on, a total plant nerd. I grew up wanting to do, like, seriously, I thought landscape design was like the coolest thing. I used to, all the other kids were like reading children's books and everything in there. I was going over to the landscape section and learning like the Latin names of all the different plants, and like, hey dad, I want a garden someday, like all this stuff. I was a total plant nerd. And I could probably just get lost in the woods and catalog stuff for a long time. And there's probably a segment of our listening audience and my audience of my writing that would prefer that, honestly.
Well, I think you'd outsurvive me in the apocalypse then, because I'd be out there eating all the poison mushrooms and things, and you'd be able to find the medicines. So I think we'd be.
Oh my gosh. Okay, poison mushrooms. Now I do have a fact to share with the audience. Okay, there are there are relatively few edible varieties of mushrooms, but in total there are thousands and thousands. I believe over 10,000 varieties of mushroom. And one of the great questions of human history to me is, how did we survive all the toxic ones to find out which ones were edible? How many people died figuring out that mushrooms were edible after the first 900 people ate one and died? Like,
I'm imagining now some sort of a barbarian king who's assigned a mushroom eater to test them all. It's like a punishment for prisoners. You got to test the mushroom. And eventually they discovered the good ones. That's probably the answer.
If you ever decide to write fiction, I think there's your premise.
The Mushroom King? All right.
Yes, the Mushroom King.
Yes.
Oh dear. I guess depending on generation, that can mean something else. But
true.
We'll stick with the we'll stick with the topic at hand.
We should segue at this time. Definitely time for a segue here.
Yes, before we get in trouble, if DEA is listening, this is not what you think it is. No. So next week, Halloween. Or I guess this coming week's Halloween. And a lot of people don't know that it's also Reformation Day. I alluded to this a little bit in the last episode, but October 31st is actually the day that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church and sparked the Protestant Reformation, which of course was then carried on by leaders like John Calvin as well. And Ulrich Zwingli, I think. I just always have fun with that name. But it was one of the most influential moments in at least Western history, and that's just doubtless. But if you think about the kind of things that they were trying to reform, and what kind of impact that has on us today, and especially on American Christianity today, the importance of it really cannot be overstated. I mean, it was a massive, monumental change in the way that Christians and theologians viewed the gospel and viewed the the foundation of Christianity. And Luther, of course, was the one who gets all the credit for sparking that. But there has always been sort of this minority within Christianity that has, maybe struck out their own path or said, hey, we just want to follow the New Testament. We don't want to get swept away with all this other church doctrine. And so this was kind of the embodiment of a paradigm shift in Christianity. And so to me, I look at Halloween every year as an opportunity to think about and celebrate the Reformation and what it means. I consider myself a Protestant, so I've got a heritage with the Protestant Reformation. That's not to say that I think that everything that the Protestants did was right or good. It's not to say that the Protestant leaders were always right or good. They have, clearly there were some things on their records that were maybe not ideal as well. But man, such a huge impact, and it kind of makes me wonder. Especially with a country with a history like ours that's been so influenced by it. How did that get completely eclipsed by Halloween?
I don't know. Probably something to do with candy and costume just being more fun than doctrine. Probably something to do with it.
I'd like to think that's not it, but it probably is. But if you look at so one of the things to me, and it's hard to understand this from kind of a modern Christianity perspective, and I'm thinking like, super church, Jesus is here to fix your life and all that stuff. It's hard to imagine that at one point people were actually walking around selling indulgences and saying, if you give X amount of money to the church, here's a get out of hell free card. And I know that's an oversimplification, but that's what the objection was too, right? Was this sale of indulgences, among other things, and also the concept of justification by faith, which to most, again, evangelical Christians, this is just this is what we grew up hearing. This is what we've man's justified by faith and not by works, and Romans, and this is something that we're very familiar with. It's hard to imagine being in a time when that just didn't make any sense. It's hard for me to imagine that anyway. But what's really interesting is that born out of the Protestant Reformation, you had this attempt to come out of the Catholic Church and form something new, and that's what happened. We had all these denominations. Originally there were the Lutherans, and then there was the Calvinists, and there was the whole Arminian split later on. You had the Anabaptists, whose history I'm very fond of. And that's where originally the Baptists came from, the Mennonites, the Amish, all those. And all these breaks come apart. And all of those were an attempt to separate from the Catholic Church as something that was corrupt, as something that needed to be, removed. And sort of the touchstone scripture for folks who take the separatist mindset, if you will, is the come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. So that's sort of the mindset of that. Then what's interesting, though, is after the Protestant Reformation, you had what was called the Counter-Reformation, where that was kind of the establishment of the Jesuit order as well, the Jesuit movement, which saw the Catholic Church sort of reinvigorated. You saw missionaries go out all over the place. And I think there was a movie made about that recently, wasn't there? About Jesuit missionaries in Japan?
Yeah, Silence was the name of it.
Silence, yes. Oh, that. You know what? I always want to recommend that movie. And it was a very, very thoughtful, very well done movie. But I just can never really decide how I feel about it. I just am always stuck in the middle, and I always go back and forth. But regardless.
Well, I take that as a recommendation right there. Really. You just kind of sold me that I need to see it now.
Well, yeah, I wasn't sure if you had seen it or not, but it's a very, very thoughtful movie. I would say you should see it. But it does raise a lot of questions, not all of which are comfortable questions for Christians. And so I think it's definitely worth a watch. I don't know if it's worth owning necessarily, but it definitely did cause a lot of stir. But regardless, back to the Jesuit Counter-Reformation, the interesting part of that is that they represented a movement to try to purify the church from within. And what you see as you look through history is a lot of different applications of this whole mindset. And the other one that comes to mind, actually, as we're approaching kind of the next holiday on the list here, as we're heading toward Thanksgiving, as we pass Halloween here, there was a similar sentiment among Anglicans in the Church of England, where you had two different sects there. And I know I was talking to you about this last week, Josh, where when I was growing up, if I didn't have enough nerd points by now, this will definitely help. One of the first books that my parents read to us was The Plymouth Settlement by William Bradford, which is a firsthand account from the first governor of the Plymouth Settlement. You know, the original colonists that came over and were not, well, they weren't here before Jamestown, but they had the first Thanksgiving, right? People usually refer to them as Puritans. That's actually a misnomer. Puritans settled in the Boston area primarily. The Plymouth Settlement was not Puritans. They were folks called the Separatists. And both of their names were gotten from their relationship to the Church of England. Excuse the monologue here for just a minute, but the Church of England was, as these folks saw it, corrupt. And there were two different thoughts on how to handle that. The Puritans said we need to stay in the church, but we need to purify it from within. We need to stay in there, be influential, and return to piety, return to holiness, and we need to cleanse the church from the inside out. The Separatists, on the other hand, were more along the lines of the Reformers. They just said, we've had enough of this. The church is not only rejecting any attempts to purify it, but is persecuting those who try to do it. It's time to get out. And that's why they got out of England as quickly as they could. They actually were in the Netherlands for a while before coming over to Plymouth and founding the Plymouth colony. And so that's an ongoing discussion that's been among, it seems to be like at the root of all dissent is that question: do you get in or do you get out?
It's interesting that there were people. I mean, that wasn't that long after the Protestant Reformation. I mean, less than 200 years. 150 years after the Protestant Reformation, and you already have new reformations taking off to reform the Protestant churches that have risen. So it makes it seem almost like this Reformation, this process of reforming or splitting off from churches is sort of an ongoing thing, something that's never really finished.
Well, right, and it's a major nod to just the corruptibility of mankind and all of our endeavors, right? No matter what we do, the things that we consider to be the absolute best, give them a few generations and they're going to fall into corruption again. It's just what we do. And like, even if you look at the reformers themselves, to be fair about it, I mean, Martin Luther had a breakthrough revelation. He had a lot of great wisdom. The dude was also a total anti-Semite, like big time. I mean, among he had some really troubling quotes about what we should do to Jews and with Jews. I think it's I've got direct quotes here. Set fire to their synagogues or schools is what he recommended in On the Jews and Their Lies, which was something that he actually wrote.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. No, seriously, the rabbis should be forbidden to teach on pain of loss of life and limb. That's Martin Luther. That's the hero of the Protestant Reformation. That's what he felt about Jews. Okay. And then, if you move over to Calvin, there is a highly publicized case in which he recommended someone to be burned at the stake for heresy in his little fiefdom of Geneva. And, at the time, Geneva was this sort of theological center. A competing theologian named Michael Servetus came into Geneva, began to teach contrary doctrine, and Calvin got the authorities involved, and he would end up being burned at the stake. And it's funny because these folks are who we consider to be pillars of the faith. Clearly, they had blind spots, but it does set up, it sets up this continual thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing where you do, like, as you said, the reformers break apart, they start their own little churches and their own little denominations. And then within time, those become corrupt too, where, we're to the point now where so many of the American denominations that you look at, conservative Christians look at them and say, wow, I can't even go there with a good conscience,
Well, it's interesting because the process you described there with these people who we think of as being heroes, having what we'll say warts, perhaps pretty big, disgusting warts on their character. If you look in the Bible, also all the kings of Israel and even some of the prophets were people who, while generally speaking you consider them to be heroes, they also had some serious areas of deficiency or of sin. Sometimes pretty shocking, gross sins. I mean, David and Bathsheba is your obvious go-to example of someone who is considered to be a very important and a godly leader who had some really big, gross warts on him. Mm-hmm. And so the whole story of the Old Testament is, I guess, the story God gives the Jews this good, perfect religion and society, and the rest of the story is them messing it up and reforming and messing it up and reforming, messing up and reforming over and over and over again. It's this continual process of the fallible people messing things up and trying to fix their errors.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I think another example that I always think of is, the line of the kings of Israel and Judah. A lot of times they'll put a qualifier on their reign. Well, the ones that the Bible considers good kings, they'll say he did all this and he did righteously and he followed in the ways of David his father and he tore down the idols and but he didn't cut down the groves. They always kind of throw that out there. Like if there was one thing that they left undone, they would make sure to mention that.
Hmm.
And I think it's to show, even people when we are trying our best, even when we are doing our best, we're just clumsy. We're fallible and we're clumsy, and we don't always get it right. And so that sets us up though, because those failings get magnified, they get followed, they get promoted and move through time with us. And then we have the choice of what to do. Do we purify or do we leave? And so, I think this is where a lot of people are right now with the political structure in America too, right? I mean, you've got political parties that basically nobody likes, and yet we stick with them. And the people who, are fed up with the political party that they're in. And by the way, this is a left and right phenomenon. This is not just something that applies to one party or the other. There's a major push to start a third party, but it doesn't get traction because this ongoing debate between, do we should I stay or should I go now? That's the fundamental question that drives this whole debate, and it's going to drive it right after. We're going to pick this up no matter how this next election goes. Within a couple weeks here, we're going to pick this discussion up right where we left it off.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, like you said, neither of the political parties is really very popular. And I can say that without being partisan, saying which one I like better than the other. Uh, but so Republicans ostensibly are for things, like for limited government, less government spending. They're supposed to not like socialism. They're supposed to be against abortion. They're supposed to be for secure borders. But if you look at things Republicans actually do, there's not a whole lot of positive action on most of those things. And as far as the Democrats on their side, there's such a wide variety of things that people who are Democrats seem to want. Some of them want socialism. Some of them don't. Most of them are pro-abortion, but not all of them are. So you have these big parties, which no matter where you stand, there's going to be something about them that you really, really don't like.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
so yeah, like you said, why do we continue to stick with these guys? I mean, full disclosure, I mean, I tend to vote Republican. But there are so many things about the Republican Party I don't like. I find the Republican Party's tendency to be hawkish and warmongering, especially, is troubling to me, but I feel like I have to vote for them. And the reason is because we are stuck inside this two-party paradigm where you have to have either A or B, Republican or Democrat, and if you don't want the Democrats, then you have to vote Republican, and vice versa.
Well, right, and at that point, it just basically becomes self-defense, right? And there's endless memes talking about this, where oh, if you don't vote for this guy, then you're voting for the other guy, and there's all this pressure that descends on people, on the separatists, we might call them, who try a different way. And I've actually been on both sides of this. I was in party leadership here in one of the major parties in Iowa, and then I also became so disgusted that I walked away from that and tried a third party startup that did not go the way that I wanted it to go at all, as they almost never do. And and I think we're at the point right now where we see how that's going. There was a low level of engagement, a low level of enthusiasm on the right side of the aisle going into this fall. There was a blue wave that was touted, and I think you started to see that, at least statistically and numerically, you started to see that break down around the Kavanaugh hearing. And it wasn't because people suddenly liked Republicans better. I mean, that there weren't a lot of policy reasons to drive that change, and it really it flew in the face of typical midterm trends where the party that's in power tends to lose seats and all that stuff. I mean, that remains to be seen if blue wave will pan out, but at least in the enthusiasm gap, there's a chance that it won't turn out that way at all. And a lot of it is because people who were in the middle or were on the fence or we're just generally disenfranchised with the whole Republican Party and its Trumpian brand, which I admit is just the stinkiest thing to happen to the right in a long time. Um, but we looked at the Kavanaugh hearings, and a lot of us just said, "Wow." I mean, as much as I can't stand some of the things on our side, I don't know if I can afford to let the opposition get power when they're doing things like this. And so then that just restarts the debate all over again. And you've got folks that are within the major parties begging you to come back because they're trying to purify from the inside and they need help. And then you've got, the other side, the people that are off in the third parties that are saying, "Hey, come join us. We desperately need your help. If we can just, reach critical mass, we will break the two-party system," etc.
Well, purifying a party is really difficult because unless there's that bind where unless you have the will and the ability to walk away from the party, and by doing so, by depriving the party of your vote, to punish the party by walking away, unless you have the freedom to do that, your ability to reform the party is really quite limited. But on the other hand, with the way our electoral system is set up, if you do follow through, on your threat, if you do use that leverage you have over the party to walk away from it, then you're just, quote unquote, throwing your vote away. So with the way our electoral system is set up,
what do you mean by that?
Well, throwing your vote away. We use in our country this we call the first past the post electoral system, and it's funny because that's the only system that we learn about in school. And until very recently, I wasn't aware that there were any other ways to vote other than first past the post. Mm-hmm. So first past the post, of course, just means that whoever you have, everybody votes for one candidate, and whoever gets the most votes wins. Which to us Americans sounds intuitively correct. Well, obviously you have to vote that way, but this system has some serious shortcomings. And probably the biggest one is that if you have more than two candidates, if two candidates are similar to each other, what they'll end up doing is just splitting the vote and letting the dissimilar candidate win. If you have candidates A, B, and C, and candidate A is very different, but B and C are different but sort of close to each other, they're sort of in the same ballpark, then B and C will have their votes split and A will win. And it's very difficult to avoid that sort of scenario in a first past the post system.
Right, and this is the complaint, right, against third parties in general, and in general elections, is that you have what some people call the Ross Perot effect, where Ross Perot runs, takes a significant percentage away from the Republican Party. Bill Clinton is swept into office, or who was Ralph Nader with the Green Party, and the reverse happened. And so whenever you get a popular third party candidate, this does tend to be the effect, and then it gets hung around the neck like a millstone. It gets hung around the neck of those third party voters. See, it's your fault that X is in office.
Right. And so if you don't have the ability to leave and go to a third party, because by doing so you're just making the other party win, how do you reform from the inside? That's a really tough question.
Well, I mean, there are mechanisms. I guess you would say that there are mechanisms within the major parties that could allow you to do that, and some people have tried to do so. So the Ron Paul revolution was based on an effort to purify the party from the inside, but ultimately that there was a short-lived burst of activity there within the party, but it sort of died down, and it got patted down by the kind of the good old boys club in party leadership. And it's the same thing, obviously, with the Bernie Sanders revolution within the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders had all the youth and enthusiasm and momentum, and ultimately still ended up getting crushed by the weight of inertia and the good old boy system that the Clintons put together there to protect themselves.
It's funny that you said Bernie and youth together in the same sentence that way. It was
Well, that's an interesting phenomenon. You had the top two youth candidates in 2012 and 2016 were two of the oldest people in the race. I mean, Ron Paul was super old in 2012, and Bernie Sanders is super old, but their ideas are, I think, appealing to the younger generation. I was going to say in the way that bell bottoms do, but it's that same sort of thing, right? Ideas that you might not be familiar with because they were preached before your time, but now you're a new generation and you're ready to hear them. And I think that's sort of the appeal of some of these.
Well, I mean, there aren't any actually new ideas in politics. I mean, nobody's had any genuinely new ideas, since Socrates.
Hey, speak for yourself. I invented the pizza party.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding.
But I mean, as far as real ideas that matter, Joel.
Oh, shots fired.
Sorry about the pizza party, but but I mean, there haven't really been any really new ideas, for thousands of years. So it's really weird that we think of those generational terms, like what appeals to young people or to old people, as if these ideas were somehow new and had just been invented. But really, everything is to some extent recycled.
Sure. So speaking of other recycled ideas, to roll it back to where we were, how would you replace the first past the post? And the first past the post, I should note, that's the one that we look at in the presidential election.
Mhm.
There's a variety of electoral techniques used at the local level that we're sort of dismissing for the purposes of this conversation.
Yeah, that's true. But for the presidential election and for the majority of elections elsewhere, we do use the first past the post system. So, like I was saying, the system that we use strongly tends to favor two parties. And the two-party system is inherently flawed because when you only have two parties, what ends up happening is you just vote for the one that's opposite the one you don't want. So you're really voting against the party you don't want. And the party you vote for is just the lever that you pull to oppose the other one. However, there are other systems that are used. The most prominent one is called the ranked voting system. It's actually used in many places. The countries I looked at that use this are the United Kingdom, Australia, and Brazil are some examples. And the idea is really simple. Instead of voting for one candidate, you vote for as many candidates as you like, or not as many as you like. Perhaps you get 3 or 4 or 5 options. And you
multiple.
And you list them in the order of your preference. So, for instance, let's say that, let's just do a hypothetical scenario and say that in 2016, Bernie Sanders breaks off, goes rogue, and forms the Bernie Party. And he is running against Hillary and Trump. Well,
hashtag burn it down.
Yes, burn it down. That could be the name of his party, actually. It's the Burn It Down Party. Anyway, sorry. I mean, Bernie puns are going to be bad no matter what you do. There's really no good place to go with that.
No, they are fantastic. They are fantastic. Take it back, or we will fight.
Instead of that, all right. So anyway, so the hypothetical scenario. So there's the Burn It Down Party, the Democrats and the Republicans. They're all running together. Now, typically in a scenario like that, the Burn It Down Party would have no chance because anybody who doesn't want Trump to win is going to vote for Hillary because voting for Bernie is quote unquote throwing your vote away. However, in a ranked choice system, you can vote for Bernie first, then Hillary second. That way. And there are various ways of counting that. There is a way called the instant runoff system. There was another one called the board-in count system. So there are various ways of handling what you do with the ranked choices. But in any case, you would vote for Bernie first because that's what the separatists.
That's what your heart says.
Yes. You vote for Bernie first.
Because you're a warm, fuzzy socialist.
Yes. And Hillary second because you don't want Trump to win. Right. And then
also because you don't want to get killed in your sleep.
Yes, yeah, no, and you don't get to commit suicide by shooting yourself in the back, as sometimes happens to people who oppose. But, anyway, so you rank your votes. You vote for Bernie first, Hillary second. When Bernie turns out doesn't have enough votes to win, then your vote would then default down to voting for Hillary. This is a good system because it makes it impossible to really quote unquote throw your vote away. You can vote for a third party candidate safely, knowing that if that candidate you voted for doesn't win, your vote will instead go to someone else instead of simply being wasted. And in countries where this is the case, you see there are actually a lot of political parties. I'm not saying any of these countries or their laws, I'm not comparing these countries to the United States in any other way per se. I'm not trying to say we should be like Australia or whatever. But if you look at the Australian legislature, there are, I counted, 11 different political parties that have seats in the Australian legislature. And if you look at the Brazilian legislature, there are actually over 30 political parties that hold seats in Brazil, as opposed to our 2 in America. So in America, having anybody in government who's not Republican or Democrat is like finding a unicorn. It basically doesn't exist. But in these other places, it's very common.
Right. And so when I look at this, I'm thinking, I would love to see this happen here. And I know that it would be a tremendous amount of work. And I also know that, that same inertia that we talked about within the major parties makes it really, really difficult to change anything having to do with voting because, as it turns out, the 2 major parties like having it this way because it's very protected. And I'm talking about to an absurd level, there are ballot access laws in states that just make it uh, ridiculously, unconscionably hard for anyone who doesn't belong to either Team D or Team R to even get on the ballot. I mean, it's just straight up ridiculous.
Well, it's really hard to gerrymander when there's more than two parties. So got to protect that important aspect of our democracy.
Right, right. Nope, that's absolutely right. And there is a major drive, and I don't ever want to leave this out when I'm discussing the possibility of third parties, because when people talk about third parties, let's be honest, everybody sort of tunes out. Okay, everybody tunes out when you talk about third parties because, like, yeah, third parties, that'd be nice, and so would a universal basic income. It's just never going to happen. But that's not really the case. I don't see it as the case anyway. So right now, a poll just came out. I don't remember who actually ran the poll. It was just a couple days ago. I will find it and put it in the show notes. How about that? But the new 2018 poll just came out showing that 2/3 of Americans want a viable third party. And that's not even, getting down to the 11 parties or the 30. They just want a viable third party. And I think a lot of people don't take that first past the post voting into consideration, but that is a tremendous amount of support. You would think that you could run on just that issue alone and get the votes you needed to make fundamental change. And so that's one statistic on it. The other one that I love is, so our good friend Gary Johnson, libertarian, pulled about 5% of the vote. Not quite 5%, I guess, last time, or no, it was 5% here in Iowa. That's right. But the third party voting in the 2016 election was way, way, way up, and it was up in 2012. Before that, the jump from 2008 to 2012 in total third party ballots cast was about 300%. And the jump between 2008 and 2016 was 800%. And I think that's reflective not so much of an embracing of the fringe party platforms as much as it is just, one, disgust with the big two.
Frustration.
And two, right, frustration, just boiling over. And then two, the tendency of younger folks, especially millennials and I think Generation Z folks now, to really be dissatisfied with anything that's not customizable. I mean, think about it. Everything that we do, everything that I've grown up with, I got a cell phone when I was in my early teens, and then they were just coming out, and I have access to a million different options just in my pocket. I can, order food from 100 different places. There's just choices everywhere, except in government, where you only get two. You get to be red, or you get to be blue, or you throw away your vote and everyone laughs at you. Okay, so these are not the options people want, and so that's why I think it's really important to discuss how we get from here to there and how that can actually happen here in the United States to give context to this purify versus separate mentality, because I think there's a separation coming here. I really do. The math justifies it. The numbers bear it out, that there is a trend happening where people are so frustrated with the way things are. I think that fundamental change is coming. The question is, how do we get there and what do we do with it?
Well, I hope you're right.
No, I mean, it would definitely give the advantage to it I see as somebody who is involved in a number of specific issues that fall into the political realm. I want to see some of these coalitions happen. I want to see a political party that is, for instance, pro-life and pro-drug legalization. I would love to see that, not because I am into drugs, but obviously because I'm into liberty. And I think it's stupid to try to protect people from themselves, and the cost of the drug war has been ridiculous. But that's a topic for another episode. I'm just saying I would love to see those two topics married and to see what you could do with it. Or say you take gun rights and prison reform. Those are, one's a traditionally right issue, one's a traditionally left issue. And what if you take those two things together? Or what if you're like you were discussing earlier? You really only have one option for a party that is pro-peace and anti-aggressive foreign policy. What if you had five? What if you had five options to choose from there that didn't also endorse things you can't stand, like racking up, obscene amounts of national debt?
Well, like you're saying, with multiple parties, you have an opportunity to have people who really represent you. When I'm just voting against D, so I feel an R to vote against D, then I'm not really being represented by R in that case. And I think that really very few people are really represented by the people they vote for. But if you do have that multi-party system where there are multiple choices, then you have a chance to have a really representatives who really stand for the things that are important to the people, and you have an opportunity for really honest political dialogue to happen instead of this false dichotomy that dominates everything.
Right. Totally agree. And I think it comes down to like the theme of this discussion has been the question of how you approach that fundamental change. How do you approach that reformation that we need to have in our country? Because clearly a reformation is needed right now. We are getting to the point where we can't live with each other anymore. I mean, a lot of people blew off this bombing that happened last week, or the attempted bombings, as a hoax. And it was not a hoax. I mean, it was clearly, save the conspiracy theories on this. This was a mentally disturbed guy who wanted people to die.
Yeah.
And so with the eruptions of violence getting more and more frequent, and I'm not talking about on a criminal level, I'm talking about on a political level. We can't keep doing this much longer. So I think it's incumbent upon us to look at this question of, is it time to maybe rethink the purify and start to think about the separate, and start to see how we can apply that within our lives and within the country. And I think that's maybe a challenge for us this week. Is, think about ways that we can do that. And here at Constructive Interference, we like to say that how we there's a thread that ties everything together, and how we apply this thinking to the threads that are in our lives, whether it's at work or whether it's in our churches as we look for ways to reform those, or in government. I think it's important to try to pull that together with that fundamental question of when do you purify, when do you separate, how do you get from point A to point B there. So thanks for tuning in tonight to Constructive Interference. Hope you've enjoyed it. We're going to have a lot of great stuff for you next week. Make sure you come back. And looking forward this week to getting up our social media pages. So keep a lookout for us. An announcement this week. They'll be on Twitter and on Facebook and on YouTube and all the places that, podcasts probably should be. Take care, and we will see you next week. Thanks.